The wind came low and dry across the plains, a lonely sound that promised nothing but more of itself. It worried the loose board on the barn and whispered through the dry bones of the grass, carrying the scent of dust and distance. For 20 years, that wind had been Elias's only constant conversation. It spoke of emptiness, and he understood its language. His cabin sat like a knuckle of bone on the vast, unforgiving hand of the landscape. Inside, the silence was a different animal, thicker and heavier, curated by memory. Every object had its place, a testament to a life that had ended long before his own breathing did. The chair by the fire, small and unscratched. The spot on the wall where a portrait once hung, now a slightly paler rectangle of wood. He was oiling a rifle by the low light of a lantern, his hands moving with a practiced economy that betrayed no feeling. They were capable hands, scarred by work and weather, but they had forgotten the shape of another's touch. The land had taken his wife, and the silence had taken the rest of him. Then came a sound the wind did not make. A frantic, desperate scrape at his door. He froze, the oil rag still in his hand. No one came here. The town, a day's ride east, had long since learned to leave the grieving man to his grief. He rose, the rifle held loosely at his side, and opened the door a crack. The wind rushed in, and with it, a woman. She was backlit by the bruised purple of dusk, her form slight and trembling. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears that had long since dried, leaving pale tracks on her skin. Her eyes, wide and hunted, found his. They were the color of a stormy sky, and held just as much turmoil. She wasn't asking for shelter from the elements. She was asking for sanctuary from the world. He hadn't looked a woman in the face this long in 2 decades. He saw the raw edges of her terror, the exhaustion that went clear to her soul. She was a settler, by the look of her worn dress, but she had settled nowhere. She was adrift. "Please," she whispered, the word nearly stolen by the wind. "Just for the night." "I have nothing to give." Her voice was rough, as if she hadn't used it in days. He saw the flicker of defiance behind the fear, a small, banked coal in the ashes of her hope. His own hope had died in a winter so cold the ground had refused to yield to his shovel. He had buried his Martha and their little girl in the spring, when the earth finally softened, but his heart had remained frozen solid. He looked past the woman, into the endless twilight. There was nothing out there but wolves and memory. He looked at her again. He saw the ghost of another woman who had once stood on this same porch, her hand smelling of flower and her smile the only sun in his sky. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or what she was running from. Questions were a currency he no longer traded in. He simply stepped back from the door, a silent, grudging invitation. She hesitated for a breath, her gaze searching his for a sign of the violence she was so clearly expecting. She found none. Only a weariness that matched her own. She slipped inside, and he closed the door, shutting out the wind but letting in a new and terrifying silence. The cabin, once his tomb, was now a shared space. He gestured with the rifle barrel toward the hearth. "The fire," he said. It was the most he had spoken to another human being in a year. She nodded, her shoulders slumping with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. She went to the fire and sank to the floor, her hands held out not for warmth, but as if in prayer to a god she no longer believed in. He watched her for a moment, then went back to his work, the rhythm of his hands a shield against the sudden, sharp reality of her presence. She slept a sleep that was not rest. It was a fall into darkness, her body curled tight on the floor by the hearth, a hand clutching the worn fabric of her dress. Elias did not sleep. He sat in his chair, the firelight casting his shadow long and thin against the wall, a sentinel guarding a tomb that was no longer empty. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, the occasional tremor that ran through her like a phantom chill. He saw the deep, purple bruise that crept from beneath her sleeve, a dark flower blooming on her wrist. He saw the scuff marks on her shoes, worn through to the sole, and understood they had carried her much farther than a single day's journey. The fire popped, a sharp retort in the stillness, and she flinched in her sleep, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. He rose quietly and added another log, coaxing the flames to a gentle, steady life. The cabin was a vessel of contained sorrows. His was a dull, chronic ache, 20 years deep. Hers was fresh and raw, a wound still bleeding. He found himself cataloguing the changes she brought to the space. The scent of rain and desperation clinging to her clothes. The slight displacement of air her breathing caused. The room felt smaller, yet less empty. He walked to the water bucket and filled a dipper, placing it on the floor beside her for when she woke. A simple, practical gesture. It was the only language of kindness he had left. His thoughts drifted, as they always did in the deep hours of the night, to Martha. He remembered the weight of her head on his shoulder, the easy way she had filled the silence not with chatter but with a presence so complete it was its own sound. He remembered their daughter, Anna, her laughter like the chiming of a tiny bell. The memory was a physical pain, a fist clenching in his chest. He looked at the woman on the floor, a stranger, and felt a strange and unwelcome stirring of something other than grief. It was responsibility. A duty to the living that he thought he had buried with his dead. He had not touched a woman in 20 years, not even in passing, not even by accident. And now one slept by his fire, her vulnerability a silent accusation against the cruelty of the world he had tried so hard to shut out. The morning broke grey and cold, the light filtering through the single grimy window like strained water. When Elias, for that was her name, though he did not know it, woke, it was to the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. The sound was steady, implacable, a heartbeat for the desolate land. The fire had been tended, reduced to a bed of glowing coals. Beside her, where the dipper of water had been, now sat a tin plate with a hunk of dark bread and a slice of dried apple. She stared at it for a long time, her hunger warring with a deeper, more ingrained fear. Kindness from a man was a language she no longer trusted. It had always been a preface to pain. She rose stiffly, her body a map of aches, and went to the door. Through the gap, she could see him. Elias. His back was to her, his movements powerful and efficient as he worked his way through a pile of pine logs. He wore his solitude like a second skin. He didn't seem to notice her watching. There was no performance in his labor, only purpose. He was a part of this place, as rooted and weathered as the ancient trees he felled. She retreated from the door and finally, cautiously, picked up the bread. It was coarse and hard, but it was food. She ate slowly, methodically, her eyes never leaving the window, her body tense to flee. When he finally finished, he stacked the wood in a neat pile against the cabin wall, a bulwark against the coming winter. He entered the cabin without a word, his face impassive. He didn't look to see if she had eaten. He didn't acknowledge her presence beyond a slight, almost imperceptible nod in her direction. He moved to a corner and picked up a broken piece of horse tack, a length of leather, and a needle. He sat on a low stool and began to stitch. His hands, which had been so powerful with the axe, were now deft and precise. The silence settled between them again, but its character had changed. It was no longer the tense, brittle silence of the night before. It was something quieter, more observant. She watched his hands. She saw the care in the way he pulled the thread tight, the patience in the repeated, careful motion. These were not the hands that had bruised her skin. These were hands that mended things. The arrival of the sheriff was an intrusion of a different sort, an unwelcome rip in the fragile tapestry of their silence. His horse was a fine, sweat-slick bay, and the man who sat it, Sheriff Collier, was starched and righteous. He reined in a few yards from the cabin, his eyes, small and hard as pebbles, taking in the scene, the stacked wood, the thin curl of smoke from the chimney, and Elias, who had stepped out onto the porch, his face a mask of stone. Collier's gaze lingered on the cabin door, as if he could see through the wood. He knew this man. Elias Thorne. A man who had bought the most godforsaken piece of land in the county and proceeded to bury his past in it. Thorne, Collier said, his voice carrying the easy authority of the law. Heard tell of some trouble over at the Miller place. A fire. Man dead. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Elias said nothing. He simply waited. Collier's eyes narrowed. Wife's gone missing. Name of Elias. Fits the description of a woman seen heading this way. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. You ain't seen a woman, have you, Thorn? Astray. The word astray was an insult, meant to provoke. Inside, Elara stood pressed against the wall, her breath held tight in her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could hear every word, and the sheriff's voice was the sound of the world she had fled, a world of judgment and possession, where a woman was property, even if her owner was dead. Elias's gaze didn't waver. This is my land, Sheriff. I know what it is, Collier snapped back. It's a place where things can get lost. People, too. I'm just saying, harboring fugitives carries a penalty. Especially when there's a dead man involved. Elias took a slow step forward, his hands loose at his sides. He wasn't a big man, but there was a density to him, an immovable quality. There's no one here that doesn't belong here, he said, his voice low and flat. It was not a lie, but it was not the truth Collier sought. It was a wall. A boundary line drawn not in the dirt, but in the air between them. Collier held his stare for a long moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. Have it your way, Thorn. But when her people come looking, and they will, don't say I didn't warn you. He pulled hard on the reins, turning the horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and suspicion in his wake. Elias watched until he was gone. He turned and went back inside. Elara was still pressed against the wall, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that was now mingled with a dawning, fragile wonder. He had not given her up. He had stood between her and the world. He met her gaze for a single, charged second, and then went back to his mending, the needle moving in and out of the leather, stitching together more than just a broken strap. For 3 days, the silence held. It was a routine built of shared space and separate tasks. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet, and tend to the land. She would wake to the smell of wood smoke and the sight of a small portion of food left for her on the table. She began to contribute in her own small ways. She swept the floor with a makeshift broom of twigs. She washed the 2 tin plates in the water bucket, her motion slow and deliberate. They were like 2 planets held in a delicate, silent orbit by a gravity they did not understand. He did not ask her to stay. She did not ask if she could. On the 4th day, he was out by the west fence line, wrestling a rotted post from the hard-packed earth. The sun was high and hot, beating down on his back. The work was difficult, his sweat stinging his eyes. He heard a soft footfall behind him and turned. It was her. She was holding out the dipper, full of cool water from the well. Her arm was steady, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder, not quite meeting his. He stopped his work, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. He took the dipper from her. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. It was the first time they had touched. A jolt, small and sharp as a spark from a flint, passed between them. He drank deeply, the water a balm on his parched throat. He handed the dipper back to her. She took it, her gaze finally lifting to the fence post he was trying to fix. The wood, she said, her voice still raspy but clearer now. It's rotten through. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact. But in the vast silence of their cohabitation, it was a conversation. He looked from her face to the broken post. He nodded once. It needs replacing. She stood there for a moment longer, as if gathering her strength. The narrator could see the landscape of her past, a place of noise and violence. A husband whose words were either curses or demands. A home that was a cage. The fire that had claimed it was not the tragedy the sheriff thought it was. It was the key. She looked at the solid new post lying on the ground, waiting to be set. The new wood, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It holds. He looked at her then, truly looked. He saw not just a refugee, but a survivor. Someone who understood that to rebuild, you first had to clear away the rot. He said nothing, but a long-held tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, just a fraction. That evening, the sharp crack of his rifle echoed across the valley. It was a sound of purpose, not of anger. He returned near dusk with a rabbit, its life a small, necessary price for their own. He skinned and cleaned it at the woodpile, his knife moving with an ingrained skill. He brought the meat inside and began to prepare it, cutting it into pieces for the stew pot. He expected her to retreat to the hearth, to her usual spot on the periphery of his world. Instead, she came to the table. She picked up a small knife he used for peeling vegetables and began to chop the wild onions he had gathered. She didn't ask. She didn't wait for permission. She simply saw a task that needed doing and did it. They worked side by side in the cramped space, their movements a clumsy but effective dance. His large, rough hands chopping the meat, her smaller, quicker ones dicing the onions and carrots. The silence was filled with the soft sounds of their labor, the chop of a knife on the wooden board, the clink of vegetables dropped into the iron pot. It was the sound of a home, a sound he had not heard in 20 years. When the stew was ready, rich and fragrant, he ladled it into 2 bowls. He set them on the table. For the first time, she did not take her bowl to the floor by the fire. She sat opposite him, in the chair that had always been Martha's. For a heartbeat, a protest rose in his throat. A territorial anger. That was Martha's place. But he looked at the woman, at Elias, and the protest died. She was not trying to replace anyone. She was simply claiming a space for herself in the world of the living. They ate in silence, the steam rising between them. He could feel the ghost of his wife at the table, a cool presence at his side. But he could also feel the warmth of the living woman across from him. The ghost was no longer a solitary sentinel of his grief. Its vigil was now shared. He found himself watching her eat, the way she held her spoon, the quiet gratitude in her posture. He finished his stew and looked at the third chair, the small one he had made for Anna, tucked into the corner. It was still empty. But the cabin no longer felt like a place of 3 ghosts. It felt like a place of 2 survivors, and the quiet, watchful memory of those they had lost. A storm broke that night, a violent squall that threw sheets of rain against the cabin walls and rattled the window in its frame. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, a stark reminder of the world's fury held at bay by 4 thin walls. The fire was their only light, casting flickering, distorted shadows that danced like troubled spirits. The storm seemed to press in on them, shrinking the small space until the air was thick with unspoken histories. Elias rose from his chair and went to the mantelpiece. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed past a tin of tobacco before settling on a small, wooden object. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of pale pine, its wings half spread as if caught between flight and stillness. Its surface was worn smooth from years of handling. He held it in his palm, the memory of the knife strokes as clear as yesterday. Elias watched him, her stillness a question. He didn't turn to face her. He spoke to the fire, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's roar. "The fever came in winter," he said. The words were stones dropped into a deep well. The snow was deep. Too deep to travel. He didn't say, "And my wife and daughter died." He didn't say, "I was helpless." He didn't say, "The silence in this cabin almost killed me too." He didn't have to. The story was in the heft of the carved bird in his hand, in the vast, empty landscape of his voice. "I carved this for Anna," he said, his thumb tracing the bird's wing. She liked birds. He placed it back on the mantel, its wings forever poised for a flight it would never take. The admission, small as it was, cost him more than a year's worth of labor. It was a crack in the frozen surface of his grief, and through it, 20 years of solitude threatened to rush out. He braced himself for a question, for pity, for the clumsy words of comfort people used when they did not understand. But Elias offered none of that. She simply watched him, her expression one of profound, solemn understanding. She knew the language of loss. She knew that some sorrows were too great to be spoken aloud, and that the truest comfort was not in words, but in a shared, respectful silence. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something had settled. He had shared the name of his ghost, and the cabin had not fallen down. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and a profound quiet in its wake. The next day, as Elias was oiling the hinge on the cabin door, making it swing smooth and silent, Elias spoke. The sound of her voice, still soft, made him pause. He had a heavy hand, she said. She was standing by the table, tracing a knot in the wood with her finger. She didn't look at him. She was offering her own fragment of truth, a piece of her story to lay beside his. And a love of the bottle. Elias stopped his work and turned, leaning against the door frame. He listened. He wasn't a settler, she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He was a gambler who'd lost his last stake. The land was all he had left. He hated it. He hated the quiet. He hated me for being a part of it. She finally looked up, and her eyes were not filled with tears, but with a cold, clear fire. She held out her arm, the one with the faded bruise. He said a wife was a possession. Like a horse, or a deed. His to use, his to break. She told him of the fire then. Not as a tragedy, but as a desperate, terrifying act of self-preservation. Her husband, drunk and raging, had overturned a lantern. The fire had caught fast on the dry timber of their shack. He had been trapped. She had not. I didn't try to save him, she said, the words stark and bare. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and I didn't look back. There was no shame in her voice, only the flat finality of a survivor. She was not the widow the sheriff imagined her to be, grieving a lost husband. She was a refugee, escaped from a war fought in the confines of a home. She was a woman who had chosen the unforgiving wilderness over the certain violence of a man. Elias listened to it all, his face unreadable. He saw the truth of her story in the haunted depths of her eyes, in the resilience of her posture. He, who had been defeated by a force of nature, by fever, by winter, was looking at a woman who had defeated a man. They were two sides of the same coin, both scarred by the world, both seeking a place where they could simply be. He picked up his oil can. A hinge works best when it's clean, he said, turning back to the door. It was his way of saying, I understand. It was his way of saying, your past has no claim on you here. The men came at dusk 2 days later. There were 3 of them, rough-looking and smelling of whiskey and entitlement. They were not lawmen. They were kin of her dead husband, their faces hard with a greedy, vengeful righteousness. They rode their horses right up to the porch, their arrogance a stark contrast to the sheriff's cautious authority. We're looking for what's ours, the leader said, his eyes scanning the cabin. He saw Elias' silhouette in the window and a cruel smile split his face. There she is. The grieving widow. Elias shrank back from the window, a wave of cold terror washing over her. It was happening again. The world was coming to claim her. Elias stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. He held nothing in his hands, but his presence was a weapon in itself. You're on the wrong land, he said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. She's coming with us, the man sneered, dismounting. She's got family business to settle. A matter of inheritance she settled, Elias replied, not moving an inch. The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Move aside, old man, before you get hurt. He took a step onto the porch. Elias moved. It was not the frantic violence of a bar fight. It was swift, economical, and brutal. He did not throw a punch. He used the man's momentum against him, a hard shove and a trip that sent the man sprawling backward off the porch and into the dirt. The other 2, startled, rushed forward. Elias met the first with a fist to the throat that took his breath and his fight. The second swung a steel bag, and Elias took the blow on his shoulder, grunting with pain but using the opening to drive his head into the man's stomach. The man folded, gagging. It was over in seconds. The leader, gasping in the dirt, pulled a knife. Elias kicked it from his hand, the blade skittering away into the twilight. He stood over the man, breathing heavily, his face a grim mask of controlled fury. He was no longer just a grieving recluse. He was a protector. A guardian. Get up, Elias commanded, his voice a low growl. Get on your horses. And don't ever come back. The men, shamed and beaten, scrambled to their feet. They mounted their horses, their eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. They cast one last look at Elias, who now stood in the open doorway, and then at the immovable man who stood before her. They turned and fled into the growing darkness. Elias watched them go, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a deep ache in his shoulder. He turned. Elara was there. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She looked at the blood trickling from a cut on his temple, at the way he favored his shoulder. The barrier between them, the invisible wall of grief and trauma, had been shattered by violence. And in its place, something new was beginning to form. Night fell completely, blanketing the land in a deep and profound peace. The only light came from the lantern on the table, a small golden island in the darkness. Elias sat in his chair, the pain in his shoulder a dull, throbbing reminder of the clash. Elara came to him with a wet cloth and a small bottle of carbolic. She did not ask. She knelt before him and began to clean the cut on his temple. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew steady. It was a clinical touch, the gesture of a healer, not a lover. But it was touch, nonetheless. For 20 years, his skin had known only the bite of the wind and the scorch of the sun. Now, it knew the gentle pressure of her fingers. He sat rigid, his body unused to such proximity, such care. He could smell the clean scent of the soap on her hands. He watched her face in the lantern light, her brow furrowed in concentration. She moved to his shoulder, carefully cutting away the fabric of his shirt to reveal the bruised, swollen flesh beneath. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and sure. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. When she was done, she wrapped it with a strip of clean linen. The barrier of not touching had been broken not by passion, but by necessity. By an act of mutual care. An unspoken acknowledgement that they were now bound together, not just by circumstance, but by the shared experience of survival. She stood, gathering the soiled cloth and the bottle. "Thank you," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, heavy with the weight of all he could not say. She stopped and looked at him. A small, sad smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a fragile thing, like a winter flower. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you." She went back to her side of the room, and the silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had faced a storm together and come through to the other side. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, at the neat knot she had tied. It was a mending. A repair. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the healing had just begun. He was no longer just a man haunted by ghosts. He was a man with a wound, being tended to by a woman who knew how to heal.